What up, folks? Welcome to the next video. For this video, I want to talk about fantasy and erotic imagination. I like that term, erotic imagination. So, fantasy. I feel there's a way in which there's a lot I can say about fantasy. I'll start by saying I feel there's a way in which fantasy has a bad rap. And I think the reason it has a bad rap is largely because of porn. And I don't think porn is inherently a bad thing. Like, I know there's corners of the porn industry that I'm sure are unethically run, but as a consumer, just like for your own consciousness and sexuality, I definitely do not think porn is inherently a bad thing. I mean, I think it can be used. It can be used unwisely. There are many people who use it addictively, or who use it when they feel shitty and they just need to click a pleasure button. In the same way someone might use a cigarette. So I think porn. So the thing about porn is it's so pleasurable so quickly that a lot of people use it for reasons that actually cause them to disembody, to disconnect from their own sense of their body, actually disconnect from their sexuality, and like it has this effect of just like your whole mind and consciousness just gets implanted in the screen. So, anyways, there's a lot of reasons to hate on porn, even though I don't think porn is all bad, and I might touch on that here. But I think most people's association with fantasy is porn. Is porn. Or this doesn't also seem universally true, but I know at least in my experience, when I was younger, fantasy felt like something that I had to keep a secret. And like when I had a partner, my first partner, earlier in our relationship, yeah, it felt like we started to open that door up eventually, but at first it felt like these fantasies are mine and they're not for other people, and I need to keep them a secret, and there's on some level something that I should be ashamed of them about. And I've also read papers that condemn fantasy and porn, but condemn fantasy as essentially just like a reliving of our childhood wounds, and that our childhood wounds can become sexualized and then become expressed through fantasy. So I just want to state, like, that is an opinion out there. It's not one that I hold hard and fast, I guess. And I think that even if there is truth in that, which there certainly, well, there definitely can be, which I'll speak to, I don't think the solution is to just avoid fantasy. At least the way that I approach life is I like to go. I have a personal mantra that the only way out is through. And so when I say that, I mean, like, if there's something activated or there's healing I need to do or there's something alive for me, I'm not gonna, like, yes, there's time to take space, but I'm not gonna completely get through that by avoiding it. The only way to really get through it and integrate what's in there is to just nosedive all the way in, go all the way in until I pop out the other side. So for those who do believe that trauma is wrapped up in fantasy, I say, why the hell not be intentional and go into it and like see what the hell is in there. So aside from all that, okay, actually I will speak to that a little bit. So my practice with fantasy is, as I've mentioned, I have a self-pleasure practice, and I mentioned this in a previous video, that sometimes more than other times, but often with my self-pleasure practice, I will essentially just, my goal is not to orgasm. My goal in this iteration of my practice is simply to conjure up a fantasy and then to let it develop a mind of its own. Because the fantasy will often end up doing things I did not expect and going places I did not expect. And I find this to be really interesting for a couple of reasons. Reason one why I find fantasy interesting is simply as a creative outlet. There's some way in which fantasy is sexual storytelling, and it's very personalized sexual storytelling. A fantasy that would be hot for me is so specific to me. It's specific to my sexual template. And other people might be aroused by my sexual fantasy, maybe because they share similar desires or similar kinks. And there's also just a thing of like erotic empathy, which I'm not sure if I'll talk about that in a later video, but it is an idea I want to explore. Erotic empathy being the ability to be turned on by other people's turn-ons. And that's actually a really useful skill because it means that when you have different partners, or if you only have one partner, that you're able to go to the places that they find hot and then find new places of synergy between the two of you. And so if you have erotic empathy, you will discover new areas of your own sexuality that you would not have seen before. But anyways, though, fantasies are so specific. Like, and that's why I love talking to people about their fantasies, because they're always really specific. Like, yeah, like the clothes being worn are often very specific. Like, it has to be a skirt. It can't be pants. Like, maybe so like for me, one fantasy I have is like, well, actually, a lot of my fantasies are interesting because I notice I'm often attracted to the scene that's happening, and not and I can actually be any of the different players in the scene. So it's like there's a plot happening, and often in my fantasies, there's a feminine character seducing a masculine character. And I use those words feminine and masculine very intentionally because it doesn't necessarily have to be a cisgendered woman. It could be an effeminate man seducing a masculine man, or it could be a trans woman seducing a guy, or whatever the case is. But I often find that dynamic to be very arousing. And so fantasies as a creative act, yeah. So often when I'm making fantasies too, I'll start by reading erotic fiction. And that's something I would highly recommend to people who haven't done that before, is go read some erotic fiction. Like, here's 3 things you can do. 1, read erotic fiction. Like, look up literotica. Look up some keyword you're into, like, I don't know, hot guy on the beach, literotica. Just see what you find. And then you essentially get to plug yourself into other people's erotic imagination. And then you get an erotic plot that you get to work with. So then the next time you're doing your practice and you want to build your fantasy, you have this plot you get to work with, but it's not going to be perfectly customized to your sexuality because you didn't write it. But since you have the plot to work with, if you bring it into your own self-pleasure, it will begin to change shape. The characters will change, the plot will change, and then it'll eventually morph into your own sexual expression. So you can use different erotica as starting points and to just give you ideas. Also, erotic comics. That's actually my favorite form of finding erotic creativity, is erotic comics online. They're just so interesting, and like I like that they can do things that humans can't do. Like, I like that, like, it's just like there are no limits to the imagination that can happen. Like, they can involve like different species. They can involve aliens. They can involve the first erotic comic I think I ever read had to do with a woman getting seduced by another woman, and the seducer ended up being a robot, an artificially intelligent robot. And then it opened up this whole plot, and I was like, wow, that is so fucking interesting. I never would have thought of this plot by myself, and it's like opening up some very specific like corner in my psyche and in my sexual psyche. And I think it's really interesting when those little corners get activated. And then porn, and of course be wary with porn, because with porn I find use porn to explore is what I'm saying. I find intentionality behind porn is everything. Sometimes I will really use it to explore. I'll just go on Pornhub with the sole intention of looking at videos I've never looked at before, finding video pockets I've never been in before, and just seeing if I can find new spots of arousal for myself. And actually, that I did discover, I discovered recently for the first time that I have a big boob fetish. I like really big boobs. And for some reason, I just never knew that. It's never been like a prominent thing for me, like breasts. I like breasts. I find them beautiful. They've never been a huge turn on visually for me. But all of a sudden, I was exploring Pornhub, and I was like, wow, for some reason, I like really big boobs. And I never knew that, and now I do. But also, when you're exploring in this way, you can find not just like, I'll do another video on specifically on types of arousal, because that's interesting. But anyways, when you're exploring, it's not just visual types of arousal you might find, but it's relational. Different forms of relationship between two people that actually evoke arousal for you. So yeah, you can use those. Oh yeah, but the thing about porn is you have to be careful that, in my experience, if I'm using porn and I want to use it consciously, sometimes I do want to use it unconsciously. Sometimes I want to go to the old videos I've been watching forever and just get off, and that's fine too. But if I'm using it consciously, like, it's always important for me to like stay in my body. Every so often, every couple minutes, like pause, like even pause the video, make sure I'm in my body, take a couple breaths. Okay, I'm back in my body, because it's so easy to get disembodied watching porn. And then making sure I'm going in with clear intention of exploration, if that's what the intention is, because again, otherwise it's easy to just look up, the types of videos that I know will just immediately arouse me. So yeah, erotic and fantasy as a form of creativity is really interesting, and you can learn about yourself. You can learn about what you like. You can learn more about your sexuality. You can learn about your tastes. You can learn about the types of relationships you're interested in. You can learn about new points of attraction, new clothes you're interested in or attracted to. It can just open up this whole world of your sexual taste, but also, if you're doing anything sexual, it generally will be a creative act. And so I find that the act of opening up fantasy just increases your sexual creativity. So that's one interesting reason. Another reason why I find it compelling personally to go into fantasy is I often learn something about myself. It's almost a form of meditative visualization of unearthing what's in there for me. And this became very evident to me because, so a couple of years ago, I helped a friend move, and she bought me a massage as a gift, which was a really nice gift. And so I went to the guy's place, and it was in Belltown in Seattle. And I went to the guy's place, and I went in, and first of all, he was just clearly gay. He had pictures of naked guys with leather boots on the walls and stuff like that. And that was fine. I was not made uncomfortable by that. Though at that point in my sexual journey, I had not been working at the sex shop yet, and I hadn't. I wasn't comfortable with my own attraction to men yet, and that's something I'm still continuing to open up. But at that time, I was definitely I'd opened a little bit. I had made out with guys before. I dated guys before too, but there was still a lot of fear and blockage. So that's the preface. I'm gonna circle all this back to fantasy. So this is a real story that happened. So I'm getting this massage by this guy. And first thing I noticed is he never had me had a towel on. I was like, that's a little weird. Usually I have a towel covering my butt. So I'm on my stomach. He's giving me a massage. He's getting close to my butt, and then he asked me to flip around. I was like, this is weird. Usually I would have my penis covered, but I flip around anyways. And then he starts massaging me, and then he starts getting closer and closer to my penis, and then he starts accidentally brushing it with his hand, and then I'm like, oh, okay, I see what's happening. And then eventually he just gives me a hand job, and then I orgasm, and then he cleans up the cum, and then the weird thing was he never even mentioned it too. He just afterwards asked for a. He's like, don't forget to review me on Yelp. And it was just this orgasm or this hand job happened was not even mentioned. Anyways, it was a really confusing experience for me at the time because it was definitely arousing. I ejaculated. It was really pleasurable. It was a cool fantasy to be taken advantage of in some ways. But it was not clear to me that I could have said no if I wanted to. I wasn't sure enough in my boundaries at that point where I wasn't sure if I could have said no if I wanted to. And so there's some way in which I felt taken advantage of, and I felt violated. And it was extra confusing because I felt violated, and it was also with a man, and I was my attractions to men were still kind of complex and raw at that point in time. So anyways, it was a weird experience. It was both pleasurable and slightly traumatic too. So anyways, fast forward, that was a couple years ago, and then fast forward to sometime this year, a few months ago, I was with a friend, and I was with two friends, and they were holding space for me, which is just to say I was opening up and sharing about some deep issue I was going through. And then one of my friends, kind of out of the blue, there was some beef between us that hadn't been resolved, and he was a little upset that I hadn't been being a good friend to him recently, and it got ticked earlier in the conversation. And then as I was opening up, he gave me just out of the blue this really kind of harsh, jarring feedback. and it felt like they were opening this safe space for me, and then I all of a sudden got like stabbed. That's what it felt like. Um, and then we got through and settled it, and like we're fine now. But I remember that feeling. I was like, ooh, that was weird. I felt like violated or something, and it was hard for me to process what was going on because like I was trying to like recognize I hadn't been a good friend to him, and like this thing hurt. Anyway, so I was carrying this like weird energy, and then that night or the next morning, I was doing my self pleasure practice, and I was fantasizing, and then my imagination went back to that massage that happened a couple of years ago, and that's the fantasy that emerged. And then like I let that plot play out, and I let it get somewhere new, and blah blah blah. And then afterwards, I took a step back, and I was like, whoa, I feel violated by my friend. And the reason it clicked was because this fantasy of being violated happened to emerge as I was in this space of feeling violated by my friend. And there was some way in which going into that fantasy helped me discover and process what was happening psychologically in my life, and then use that information to move through my situation. And that's just an example, but I find that all the time, that because the thing about fantasies is, yes, they have a plot line, but they're ultimately this like incredibly intricate, complex, nuanced, woven narrative of different energy pockets and expressions. And it's this constantly shifting energy movement of energy pockets and expressions. So, for example, like, let's say you have a fantasy that you're walking in a park, and you meet. This is kind of an intense one, but maybe you have this fantasy. I know a lot of people do have rape fantasies. This is a trigger warning, because I'll do a more chill fantasy. Let's say you're walking in a park with a friend, and it's late at night, and you're sitting next to each other, and you all of a sudden are inching closer and closer, and then you start making out. Maybe that's a tame fantasy, but whatever. That's a fantasy. So there's so many elements going on, even in that little frame. One is you're with a friend that has like a certain energetic quality to it, and then like all of a sudden let's make the fantasy more interesting. Let's say you're both dating other people. You're both dating other people, and you're with a friend, and then you make out with each other. Okay, so that has all kinds of energetic qualities to it, like the feeling of being with a friend, and then the feeling of things getting closer and closer, and the feeling of, oh shit, there's this thing I'm not supposed to do. I'm not supposed to cheat on my partner, and they're not supposed to cheat on their partner. This feeling of like forbiddenness, and then it's getting closer and closer, and that's creating a feeling, and then finally it just happens, and then the fact that it's all happening in a park, in a public location, where you can be seen, where you're not supposed to be seen. There are so many different nuanced like feelings just in that one little plot line. But you could make up any plotline, and they're just as nuanced, and you can take any plotline and make it more and more and more nuanced if you really want to go into your fantasy. So anyways, I find fantasies interesting there too, because there's something about like that energetic quality that is revealing something to you about yourself. And if you're the type who appreciates self-inquiry, you can use that as a starting point to just notice what you're aroused by, and maybe you don't have to do anything about it. Maybe you just notice and say, this is a fantasy, I find it hot. Or maybe you can like dig around and see what's in there. Like, what is it about being seen, like being in a public place, being seen, that turns you on? What is it about breaking rules? If the fantasy is cheating on your partner, like what is it about breaking rules that turns you on? What is it about breaking other people's rules that turns you on? Right, there's like, you can look at it that way too, and I find that to be interesting. And then the last thing about fantasy is open it up with partners. It's really scary. It doesn't have to be scary. I should say, like, for me, when I first started doing it, it was really scary. I remember my first time I opened a fantasy with a partner. I was uncomfortable, just straight up. We just like suddenly emerged into a teacher-student dynamic. She was super comfortable in it, and she was like giving me homework, and I was uncomfortable. I felt awkward. I didn't know how to express myself. And that's fine. It happened, and we had an experience, and I learned about it. And then I kept doing it and kept practicing, and now I fucking love it, because essentially if you let yourself, and this kind of gets into role play, but if you let yourself get completely into a fantasy with your partner, you get to have the experience of like being someone else, and not necessarily just being someone else, but like tapping into a very specific like energetic expression within yourself and relational dynamic with your partner, and you would be surprised how deep you can get into it. And I think it's because like when the sexual energy is present, it can be so intense, it like washes everything else out, so you can just be it's like the relational dynamic you're in is real, it really feels real. It really does. And so there's a couple ways to get in it. One, maybe you have a fantasy that you know very well that you want to play with a partner. It might be scary, but you can just share that with your partner and say like, hey, here is a fantasy that I have and that I want to play out with you. That's one option. I remember I worked. I say I worked, but I'll state why I said that. I played with a woman once. I met her. I think I met her online on FetLife. FetLife is like a kinky Facebook, I guess. But I met her online, and she was at the time was a female dominant, and I was looking for a woman to dominate me essentially and open up that connection and see what it felt like. And it was a really interesting experience. But for the way we were getting to know each other, the idea was we met a couple times, and then she was going to create a scene for us to play in and lead the scene. And so the way we set it up, she actually gave me like this packet of, I filled out like all my fetishes, I filled out all my fantasies, I filled out all my safety concerns. It was like a 8-page packet, and then I like filled it out and gave it back to her. And this wasn't a paid engagement, by the way. We were just like casually connecting sexually. But that's why I said use the word work instead of play, because it was very formal feeling. And then she also gave me an assignment of writing a piece of erotica and then sending it to her so she could get a sense of what my taste was. So I had like given her all of this sexual information, and then we met at an Airbnb, and then she made a scene, and it was super hot. On the whole, I liked it. It was a really cool experience because I gave her my information, my desires. Other ways to make a scene with a partner, though, are... This is what my partner and I usually do now, but just like let it... Like, know each other's turn-ons for sure. Know that, like... and that requires a bigger conversation, too, of, like, what are your turn-ons? Being able to talk about that. Because maybe you like being in control. Maybe you like when your partner's in control. Maybe you like being totally surrendered. Maybe you like the feeling of being a little like an animal, like a dog, where you don't have to think, you don't have to have words. And you like the feeling of your partner, like, owning you, like a dog or something. And then that's one place to start. So, and then just see what emerges with your partner. I was with my partner, and this was kind of an interesting one, but like, she, I know, has desires around being corrupted. Like, she finds that to be hot, and that's not specifically a turn on for me, but like, I'm happy to play with it. It's fun, and it can be hot through like erotic empathy. But one time we were in a bathtub, and we were in a bathtub, and like, I had the idea of putting olive oil all over us in the bathtub. Kind of a long story how we got there, but so it was really slippery, but it felt great. And then just this scene emerged spontaneously where we were talking, and some scene emerged where she was, because her makeup, that's right, she had eye makeup on, and the olive oil was making it look really like scary and nasty. And a scene emerged where she was like, it almost felt like some like heathen, or like so I was like this priestly character who was like very like judgmental and like morally superior, and she was actually on top of me, and she was this like to me this like disgusting heathen who was like trying to corrupt me, and I was chaste, and she was trying to get me to get me to like break my chasteness and have open up my sexuality in that engagement. I actually ended up having to use a safe word because something started feeling uncomfortable, and I'm hoping I will talk about safe words in a video shortly. But the point I'm making there is like, we had a couple energetic threads that we knew were interesting, of like just one person corrupting the other person, just playing with that, and then it just spontaneously emerged in a sexual interaction. So the idea there is like, you can really just plan something out with your partner and like relatively script it, kind of like I did with that one lady, or you can just talk about your fantasies with each other, talk about your turn-ons, and then see if it naturally emerges. And if it doesn't actually emerge, this is where you can make a container. Again, this actually would probably be the best place to start, because usually spontaneous... I don't know if this is true for everyone. For me, usually like the spontaneous stuff happens, but it happens much more potently after I've already made a container to frame the thing. So for a container, I'd say the easiest way to do it is just talk about the scene together. I'll give one more example. The first container that I built with my partner is I was a teacher and she was a student. Like, again, knew that was a turn on for her, and I was happy to get in that role. It opened up a lot for me also. And yeah, and it was fun. It was fun to like just totally be in that role. And so we decided ahead of time we're gonna do a 5-minute scene. I was effectively planning it out because I was the one in power. I had her dress up. I dressed up. We just had a small scene, and I, talked in that role, and she talked back, and then I disciplined her and like spanked her a little bit, and it was hot, and it was fun, and it only lasted 5 or 10 minutes, but it was emotionally intense. And then we got out, and then we did aftercare and cuddled, and then we talked about it, and it was great. And we've done a couple of structured scenes like that, and now those kind of scenes emerge spontaneously. But doing structured scenes is still helpful, and definitely I don't think one should ever stop doing them. So, okay, I'll wrap up here in a moment. I know this video is going a little bit longer than the others. Why would you want to open up fantasy with your partner? One, it's super fun. It is super fun. If you can let yourself get into it, it's incredibly fun. It takes you on a totally new ride. It's incredibly bonding and connecting with your partner because it's very vulnerable to go to those places. It feels like you're opening up new like terrain in your psyche and in your sexuality. When you do it, you will have the experience of feeling like there's new terrain being discovered in your consciousness and in your sexuality, and that's cool. And you can learn about yourself, especially if there's like a fantasy or a turn on you've had forever but you've never played with it. If you bring or if you bring intentionality to that and play with it, see what it's like, see what opens up. Maybe it will intensify, and maybe you'll learn something about yourself. Maybe you won't actually like it as much in real person, or maybe you do like it and maybe it moves through you, and I don't know, like so many things can happen, but you'll never know unless you go there. So the point I'm making is, if you have fantasies, maybe you have fantasies you know about, see if you can share them with your partner, and see if you can even open them up with your partner. If you don't have fantasies you already know about, but you'd like to get to know your fantasies because you would like to get to know your own sexuality and sexual creativity better, use the tips I talked about before. Look at other people's fantasies, create your own fantasies, get to know your own erotic imagination, and then again, see if you can bring that to your partner, and then play with it. I also recognize in this video, I was making the assumption that you have a partner. You might not have a partner, and that's fine too. Maybe at some point you will have a partner, maybe you won't. Pickup play is also an option, and I'll go into that later, but there's lots of ways. I don't know if I'll make that the emphasis of this video series of how to find someone to play with, or how to find a partner if that's what you're looking for, but there's a lot of ways to do it. Cool. Fantasy is fun. Fantasy is fun. And I'll say the main reason I love talking with people about their fantasies, other than I find it just super interesting, is it usually makes for a really connecting conversation. It's not something we talk about often, our fantasies. And so if you're able to share it with another person, it often feels vulnerable, and it makes you feel close to that person. And there is a too much too soon effect, or there can be. Like for me when I was younger, I had so much shame around my sexual desires and my fantasies that sharing them with people, sharing any details with people, was excruciating. Like it was too much. I had to open it up really slowly. And so I want to acknowledge, like, maybe you're in a place like that too, where it's like you do have some fantasies, or like maybe even you have secret desires, but it's just really scary to open them up. There's no rush. There's no rush. And that might not be the camp you're in too. Maybe you feel pretty comfortable with your desires, and maybe you haven't shared them, or maybe you have, but whatever. See what it's like to share them with a safe person, even if it's not your partner. That's another thing too. I'll share fantasies with my friends, and I like to hear about my friends' fantasies because vulnerability is great. Okay. That is all. Thanks for listening. I hope something in this video was interesting or useful, or valuable or beneficial, or some other positive word. Cool. All right, I'll see you guys next time.